Good morning and welcome to Behind the Screen on the Iconic Production channel. I am JM, your host, and with me is just myself. It has been a crazy week so far, but it has been a good week. We had some great Deadlands episode last night. Some great time in the Deadlands. John, good to see you. Bob, Restar, Rook. Rook, as always, thank you for your generosity. It was a great session last night, and I hope that you, if you haven't been checking it out, go check out the Deadlands game. We're running the horror at Headstone Hill by Pinnacle, and it has been wonderful. Rook, thank you for your generosity and your in your donations, as always. Thank you. We've got some new alerts set up. I didn't have them set up on the starting screen, but hopefully as things roll out, we'll just continue to make little tweaks and updates to the channel as we go forward. So today, what are we talking about? We are talking about continuing our series on what is fantasy, how to incorporate the different subgenres of fantasy, and hey, there we go, Bob. Woohoo! And move that up so that is easier to see as we are rolling. We covered epic fantasy last week, and which was a lot of fun. We did 3 episodes on epic fantasy, interrupted only by our discussion on the Dark Souls role-playing game, which I've talked with Bob about, and he is definitely in for doing a one-shot on the channel with. So I'm very excited about that. Yes, and if you did not check out the Deadlands game last night, it did look like Rook his character Wickers was about to die. He made out with only a massive scar and a lost nose. We shall see how that all plays out. So today we're talking about our sources for high fantasy, defining high fantasy. What is that about, and what makes it different from other subgenres of fantasy? So I would say that the key thing about high fantasy is, if epic fantasy is focused on the heroes, high fantasy, huzzah, is focused on the world, but not the natural world like epic fantasy is, but the magical world, the sense of wonder and enchantment that a world steeped in magic can bring. A good example from kind of our current zeitgeist would be Elden Ring. As you're moving about Elden Ring, there are just moments where you encounter things that are wondrous and weird and beautiful and clearly magical. So if, again, epic fantasy is the fantasy that focuses in on... I'm going to move that off to the side. Again, as I said, we were looking to see how this was going to work. I'm going to make that just a little smaller and move it off to the side. No, leave it. I have been told to leave it by my wonderful advisor, Mr. Bob Crumb. I need to get him a robe and a hat and a royal authority regalia. So anyway, difference between epic fantasy. Epic fantasy focuses on the people and the natural world. High fantasy focuses on magic. Magic is everywhere. It's steeped everywhere. You can't move through a high fantasy realm without tripping over a wizard, seeing a spell, seeing something magical. One of the things that another exemplar of this would be, and we're going to talk about our sources today, R. Scott Baker. In his second Apocalypse series, the Gnostic wizards have the war cants that they have them named, and when you do this war cant, this is the effect. The Anagogic wizards have names for their spells as well, like the Dragon's Head, and there's just a ton of them. I'm more of a fan of the Gnostic sorcery than the Anagogic sorcery, but you are definitely seeing like name spells, repeatable spells. Magic is less mysterious in high fantasy. It's more prevalent. You get repeatable actions. Think kind of our role-playing game. If Greyhawk is sort of our exemplar of gaming in epic fantasy, Forgotten Realms or Golarion is going to be our exemplar for playing a game in high fantasy. Magic items are all about. Waterdeep has multiple magic shops. Spells are repeatable. This comes from Jack Vance as well, right? Jack Vance's spells. This is for Ben Feehan, who I don't know if he's in the chat today, but Ben Feehan has this feel, or asked what the difference is. What makes it high fantasy? Well, high fantasy, Dying Earth, you have these spells that are memorized and they have repeatable and magic is more prevalent, but it's also more well known. Other things that make a high fantasy feel. Well, when you look at high fantasy, there's a ton of ruins about the place. We have ruins in epic fantasy, but these are magical ruins alive with monsters and races and magical items. The reason you go into ruins is to pull out magic from the past, specifically magic from the past. So, right, dungeons in the Dungeons and Dragons gives us this feel. When there are the divine powers in epic fantasy, they are remote, right? We very rarely see the Valar, if at all, except in reference and working through agents in Lord of the Rings. Gandalf being the main one, but you also have the Eagles when they come in at the end of Return of the King. In the Silmarillion, right, the Valar, the Silmarillion probably starts at a epic fantasy, or sorry, as a heroic fantasy, and then kind of moves down into epic fantasy. Because right at the beginning of the Silmarillion, what do we have? We have Orome riding through the forest. We have Tulkas wrestling with Melkor, but those kind of go away after the end of the First Age, right? The War of Wrath happens. Again, we have the Valar moving about in Middle Earth. Well, technically Beleriand, and then moving back. So in high fantasy, the gods are not just real; they're ever present in the world. So I love Golarion. My one problem with Golarion is the nation of atheists. Now, I know that they have some intellectual hoops that they jump through to get to that point, but in high fantasy, the gods are real and their powers are real. You can go visit their plane. You can go visit their temple. Their clerics can produce evidence of the god's existence. So, yeah, there you go. All right, so let's see what Restar asked. So allegorical fantasy is sort of its own thing. We'll talk a little bit about Narnia when we get into the Crossworlds genre that we'll talk about here towards the end. But yes, there are, depending on the phase of Narnia, you kind of get a different feel for that. Yes, Rook, and one of the things that is sort of kind of steeped in epic fantasy is that not only do the gods exist, but the right heroes with the right fate at the right time can even slay gods, right? That's sort of a staple of this genre. Other things that you will find in epic fantasy is, right, epic fantasy tends to be primarily focused on humans. Low fantasy is definitely humanocentric. Epic fantasy is, high fantasy gives us a lot more races, gives us a lot more species to play with. Yes, we have elves and dwarves kind of as a staple of epic fantasy, but in high fantasy, they have their own empires and kingdoms, and you get even stranger creatures populating the world. Because magic has this influence that is constantly spreading throughout and keeping sort of the races that may have faltered off or died off because of their access to their gods and their magic, are able to stem the tide against humanity. Also, high fantasy is less concerned with a single world in general than traveling to other worlds. We may see in Elric, we see different planes of existence. Even in Raymond Feist's Rift War, there are two worlds, and then there's this space between worlds where things exist. We go multiversal. And in Restar, yeah, you're referring to the old the Beckme set. Yeah, if you reached Immortals were gods in Beckme, and that was the step where you could claim divinity. So these are things that kind of focus on in high fantasy. Lots of magic, plethora of species, plethora of planes. The world is rife with magic. Now, why would we do this? And we'll talk about this on Thursday, but one of the reasons is it because it provokes a sense of wonder and enchantment. Epic fantasy can very much feel like it's not too far removed from our world, right? Middle Earth is set in a historic past. The Wheel of Time is a potential future vision or past vision, depending on where we're at in the cycle of the wheel rotating. Shannara starts epic and then I would say moves heavily into high fantasy. Another one that I would say is, I would also probably add the Sword of Truth into epic fantasy as opposed to high fantasy. And again, this is like a Venn diagram, right? Kind of all moved around. So what are the exemplars that I would say is our sources? Now, if you're a member of the Iconic Production Discord, a patron of our Patreon, you get access to the Discord. We've been discussing this quite a bit on the Behind the Screens sub-channel, but some of the ones that I came up with as kind of exemplars of the field, and our group has added several more to this, let me pull up my notes. So for me, Malazan Books of the Fallen is probably top of the list. You have squad mages in the army. You have high mages throughout the Empire. You have ascendants, people who just randomly stumble upon the path towards godhood. You have gods, you have elder gods, you have ascendants, you have multiple different types of magic. You have the Warrens, and then you have the Holds, and then you have all these other things. Magic is steeped so deeply in the world, right? Magic in Malazan, spoiler alert, are literally the veins of the god of magic. They are like, Karul opens up his veins and bleeds himself out to create the Warrens. It's so magical that there's actually a natural reaction, Ototarl, that negates magic. Baker's Second Apocalypse books. There are 5 or 6 schools of magic, maybe 7 or 8 schools of magic. There are enough of these anti-magic chore that just sort of exist. There are non-min mansions. There are skin spies moving about. There are priests and priestesses who interact with the 100. All of this sort of comes together to form a high magical background. We talked about David Eddings being epic in his first series of the Elenium and the Belgariad. I would argue that in the Malorian and the Telmuli, the follow-up series to both of those, we step into the realm of epic fantasy. There's much more magic. In the Malorian, there's a demon invasion going on in Maloria. In the Telmuli, we get to see much more about how the gods work. Wizard of Earthsea, like the Earthsea series by Ursula K. Le Guin. Michael Moorcock's Multiverse. The Eternal Champion, Elric, Corum, Hawkmoon. These are all high fantasy, kind of toward the end of a magical cycle, if you will. The Chronicles of Amber by Roger Zelazny are so fantastical that I would put them in the genre of high fantasy. For Ben, Jack Vance, because yes, it is science fantasy. It has that feel of we're at the end of the Earth's life cycle, and magic is sort of indistinguishable from technology, but that gives it this high fantasy feel. And then I would also put the Rift War series by Raymond Feist, as well as any D&D fiction set in Forgotten Realms or Pathfinder fiction set in Golarion. Bob, that is a great question. So I've actually thought about this one. If we're going into science fantasy, or as I like to call Star Wars, space wizards in the future past, it depends much like fantasy, it depends on what era you're looking at. So much like Tolkien or Eddings, right? Because original trilogy, I would call epic fantasy, right? It follows Campbell's arc. It follows the Force is very rare, and we meet one wizard, then we meet a second wizard, and then eventually we have a Dark Lord. on his dark throne. We have a dark knight. Right? We have all of the it's a good versus evil dichotomy. But as soon as you step back into the Republic, and especially, this is my personal opinion, but Legends are still canon in my head, or you step back to the High Republic times, the times of Ulic Caldroma, the Knights of the Old Republic era, that's high space fantasy, right? There are Jedi just all about the place, and Force artifacts, and how many different derivations of the dark side users have we seen beyond the Sith as we've gone back. So I think the roots of Star Wars, well, maybe not the roots. The roots of Star Wars are epic fantasy, but as the canon expanded and we started to look back at the golden age of the Republic, we saw a lot more high science fantasy. And when we get into our sci-fi series on this, it's going to be a lot of fun to talk about space fantasy, because outside of Star Wars, there are fewer games that I feel like do space fantasy well. I would say Starfinder is one of those ones that I think does it really, really well. Yeah. Oh, that is a good point, Restar. I would honestly say that depending on who you're reading for Arthur tends to stray very closely towards epic fantasy, but there are some variations of Arthur that feel very much more high fantasy, especially as you get away from Camelot, right? Camelot is the center of stability, so we have the only wizard is Merlin and Morgan Le Fay, but as you get out, the further you get away from Camelot, the weirder it gets. We get giants and dragons and creatures like that. So, yeah. So that's kind of our look at high fantasy. So again, to review, we talked about our exemplars: Malazan, the Rift War series by Raymond Feist, Ursula K. Le Guin's Earthsea trilogy, Dying Earth by Jack Vance. We'll stop at the 4 right there. What is kind of the core experience, and we'll talk more about what the core experience is. But again, high level, lots of magic that creates wonder and enchantment. Magic goes deep and wide. It is far more predictable and replicatable. I think one of the problems that I have with some of the modern high fantasy authors, I'm going to put Brandon Sanderson in this. This is my main problem with Sanderson. He does write high fantasy, especially in some of his later stuff. Because magic is repeatable and definable, we get these feelings of magic is just a science we don't understand. Or it falls into what I will call the Columbo trap, which is if you're paying close enough attention, you can feel cleverer than the protagonist because you've solved the rules before the protagonist has. So there are some issues around high fantasy in that regard personally, because I think, right, magic done well provokes wonder and enchantment. Magic systems done poorly is essentially a smart person's endorphin rush as you try to figure out the puzzle before anyone else does. We see this, a plethora of planes, species, types of magic, with types of wizards, and ruins that sort of exist, right? Ruins in epic fantasy give a feel of the world, right? The fact that Amun Sul used to be a watchtower lets you know that this world is less than it was. Ruins in high fantasy tend to be the objects of quests, or hold the objects of quests. And in addition to a plethora of species, we also have a plethora of monsters, right? Gygaxian fantasy, especially in 5th edition, like 3rd edition on, is our exemplar of high fantasy for a lot of reasons. Pathfinder as well, because monsters get created by magic and they just go out into the world and they replicate and they kind of explode. So that is our baseline for high fantasy. Hopefully I have defined epic versus high fantasy well enough that we can see sort of a division, and maybe when it gets muddied towards the center, we can at least see that as we get to the edges of the Venn diagram, we can see how these two genres are separate. Good, Bob. I appreciate that. So, on Thursday, we're going to be back. We're going to be talking about mechanics that replicate the high fantasy genre well. We're going to talk about games that do it well. We're going to talk about settings that do it well. And then on Tuesday, we're going to hit our how do we replicate this for our players at the table. And I think next Thursday, a week from Thursday, I'm going to review Blackbirds, a new Zweihander game that has come out. It was the setting in I believe I know the creative director from Riot Games, who do League of Legends. I believe it was his campaign setting that he was running, and then they adapted to Zweihander. I will have more details on that as I do my research for that next Thursday, but I'm really excited about talking about high fantasy for the next 2 days. Padre, it is good to see you. I'm looking. Let me know what you thought. If you're watching this on YouTube, leave a comment. I always enjoy responding, interacting with people. Raything left a comment on our Dark Souls video. Glad to hear that it at least sparked your interest. We will be back tonight with the next episode of the FET 5, which is our Torg Eternity game. I am really, really excited about that. There is high fantasy in Torg if you head to Isle, which we are not, but just sort of tossing that out there. Welcome to Torg's Day. And then on Thursday, we'll be doing more of our behind the screen look at high fantasy and what mechanics we can expect from a high fantasy game to kind of reinforce the feel of the genre. And then Saturday, we're going to be doing our next episode on exploring Glorantha. We're going to be looking at the Kingdom of Tarsh, kingdom just to the north of the Kingdom of Sartar that has a deep tie and is probably your next best step stepping outward from Sartar as you're learning to explore Glorantha. So, until next time, stay safe, stay healthy, stay gaming. As always, I am JM. This is Behind the Screen. We are Iconic Production. You can find us on social media. You can find us here on Twitch. You can find us on YouTube. And if you would like to, please consider joining us at Patreon. We have a Discord server where we are going to be, or we're active and we're talking about all of our games and gaming and just life in general. And if you're going to be at Gen Con, we will be at Gen Con. I will have a booth there that I will be working at, along with some of our iconic friends who will be there. It will not be a strictly iconic booth, but will be a plethora of JM related projects that are all going to be in one booth. And I have an announcement to make. We are slowly climbing both on Twitch and on YouTube. And when we get to 1,000 subscribers on YouTube, I'm giving away a complete set of the Fading Suns first Kickstarter books. So the core rules, the GM screen, the universe, the character book, the Game Master's book, the faction book, Intrigues and Escapades, and the 3 Imperial dossiers that came with that first Kickstarter. So I've got a set that I will be, and a set of cards and tokens. So I will be giving that away when we get to 1,000 subscribers on YouTube. So if you're watching this on YouTube, please consider subscribing and liking the video, and I will announce how we're going to pick that. It's going to be completely at random, and we're going to, well, I mean, as random as we can get with a random number generator on a computer, which, as we all know, is not truly random, but we will get that sent out to one lucky subscriber of the Iconic Production channel. So, until next time, stay safe, stay healthy, stay gaming. John, thanks for pointing that out. I'll get that put in there. And we will see you all tonight for Torg and Thursday for more Behind the Screen. Until then, have a good one.